Hello. Today we're going to look at some different sorts of German stoneware in a bit more detail. All these can be found on the banks of the Thames at low tide on the foreshore, and the first industry we're going to look at is Siegberg. Now the guys from Siegberg really perfected the first true stoneware in the last years of the 13th century, sort of 1290 onwards, and founded a great industry which was widely traded from Germany. They're not hugely common in England, but they were definitely imported from about 1450 to 1500 in quite large numbers as drinking jugs, small drinking jugs. The industry, as I said, started about 1290 and went right through into the early 17th century, about 1625. In the early years, mainly plain forms, sometimes with a prunte or a little circular decoration, but certainly after about 1550, very highly decorated examples of Siegberg stonewares are found, very beautiful and covered all over in decoration. But these are not so widely traded to England, so we don't find them very often in London. Let's have a look at some pieces of Siegberg stoneware. First of all, stoneware is obviously a very hard material, very hard clay, and it sort of has that sort of sound to it. Buff coloured stoneware with a very matte finish, apart from some areas which are also quite matte, normally matte, some brown areas that almost look like a dusting of brown, which is caused by ash in the kiln. So it's very distinctive, and you get these frilled bases on the pots there. Again, matte coloured with just that dusting of brown glaze. The two very common types of drinking jug. There's the Trichter Halskrug, which is German just for wide-mouthed beaker, and here's a picture of one of those. And then you also get a bit later the Jakoberkanne, or Jacob's can, which is also a very distinctive shape, and here's a picture of one of those. The Trichter Halskrug, or the wide mouth beaker, has a round body and going up to a wide mouth, obviously, and quite distinctive little handles on the side there. And the Jakoberkanne is very tall and thin, as you can see from the photograph, with obviously decorative rilling around the outside and very straight-sided, with a little sort of cordon near the neck as well, which you see. Another form of Siegberg drinking vessel, which is rare in London. It's much more of a German way of drinking. It's a very little foot there, and you can see it comes out and then turns up to the side there. And it's basically something that you could hold in your hand like that and just drink, like the early teapots or tea cups without a handle. Just have it in the hand and drink like that, like drink a toast. And that's a very German way of drinking in this period, the late medieval period. So possibly these were brought over to London by German merchants rather than the English, who liked to have their drink from a jug, and maybe they got into the Thames from there. They were certainly found near the Steel Yard, which was the centre of German merchants at that time. Here's a few examples of the more highly decorated later Siegberg jugs. These were known as Schneller, and they're very straight-sided jugs there and very beautifully decorated. That concludes the Siegberg industry. Turning now to Langeweer industry. This is also a late medieval industry, producing pottery from about 1350 and continued about 1550. Not so well known because they didn't produce decorated wares, and they didn't go later than 1550 when most other industries were starting to highly decorate their pots and jugs. But they do come across as imports into England and are quite frequently found around the country. Again, they were drinking jugs with frilled bases. That's obviously quite a large one, and that a very little one. One of the distinguishing features of it is an iron wash, which is inside or outside, and that gives a sort of purplish finish to the pot, either on the inside or on the outside. You can see that really. So that would distinguish it from some of the earlier and later stonewares. There's a purple wash there. If you compare that to the Siegberg, which I mentioned just now, rather matte finish with a bit of a brown spotting, dusting there, as opposed to a purple wash for the Langeweer pieces. Some of the very early Langeweer imports, sort of 1350 onwards, have a sort of yellowish stoneware effect. Also the frilled base is a good indication that you found an early piece of stoneware. Certainly if it's got a frilled base, it's going to be before 1550 at the latest. Not so much purple wash on this one. And yes, as I said, they continue to about 1550, and now we'll turn and have a look at some of the other industries. Let's have a look now at some of the products of the Roarin and Aachen industries. Roarin is now actually in Belgium, although it's only a mile from the German border, but at the time of production it was part of Germany. These industries flourished from about 1500 right through to the early 17th century, 1610, 1620, something like that. And again, the output is stoneware, brown drinking jugs. And in the early period, they were undecorated from about 1500 to 1550, and you get these frilled bases again in that sort of late medieval tradition. But from 1500 onwards into the 1600s, they became very highly decorated, and there's some beautiful examples. To distinguish the products of Aachen and Roarin, which are very common in England, lots of imports right around the country. Stoneware, of course, so highly fired and impervious to liquids, which was their great advantage as drinking jugs over the earthenware jugs of the medieval period, is the very glossy glaze. Grey glaze inside, brown glaze as well, but very glossy and smoothly covering the pieces there. But different from the later stonewares there, you can see the later ones have that sort of salt glaze speckled effect, the typical Freken industry, whereas the earlier Cologne and Aachen and Roarin ones have a smooth brown or grey glaze there. Yes, as I said, undecorated drinking jugs. Here's a picture of a typical Roarin drinking jug complete. And then later on you get decorated examples, very highly decorated. That's the lip around a jug, and you get those sort of rosettes, and I suppose it's a stylized flower or a sunburst on it. Again, smooth brown glaze rather than a speckled glaze. Here's another rim of drinking jug with a very nice lion head mask on it there, face mask of a lion. That's also quite nice. And then you get beautiful decoration all over the body. There's a little cherub there, so you get Lots of figures. You also get dated jugs, even signed by the master potters who produced them, and panels of wording and identification of the different scenes. So you get very elaborate jugs with the leaders of Germany all named, the 7 electors of Germany, and mythological and biblical characters, biblical scenes very common as well. And it's always great to find sherds from those decorated jugs there. They're very finely produced. Okay, let's go on. A smaller industry was one which was based around Cologne, or Köln, it's known as, on the Rhine in Germany. And this industry produced drinking jugs in stoneware in the early 16th century, so 1500, 1550. Normally small jugs and very specific decorations of, well, 2 different sorts really. One of oak leaves and acorns in tendrils going around the pot, and here's an example of one of those. And the other sort was roses and petals, and I found a few examples of those. You can just see the sort of tendril with the leaf coming off that, and then a rose with its petals there around the top of the jug, probably more likely to be that way up, I think. And that's quite distinctive of the Cologne industry as well, and they're nicely produced early 16th century stonewares. And here's a picture of a complete rose and leaf decorated jug. One more thing about the Cologne industry, they were the first people to put a face mask around the shoulder and the neck of a jug. Very finely produced naturalistic face masks, which were later copied and used by the Freken potters to make the famous Bartman jugs as well. And we'll move on and look at some of those now. One of the largest German stoneware industries was based around Freken in Germany, again near the Rhine. And I think it's called Freken because when I find them, they're always Freken broken. Anyway, enough of that. They started producing around 1550 and carried on after 1700. The main imports into London were for 1550 to 1650. After that they dropped off in popularity a bit as English glass wine bottles became used rather than German stoneware bottles for importing wine and for drinking wine. So the classic example of the Freken industry is the Bartman jug, which is a very round-bodied jug on a small base and has the face mask at the top, which is nearly universally recognised when found on the foreshore, and everyone loves to find a face mask. It's just been my luck, I've never found a Freken complete one, but only broken bits. The earlier faces, that is from the 16th century, were much more naturalistic, much more finely executed. There's a bit of a beard there, quite nicely done. But the later ones in the 17th century, so 1600 onwards, become more and more grotesque, and some of them frankly very scary indeed. So you get some rather mad looking people there. There's a guy there. They were also copied in England in different places around Fulham as well, in the stonewares there. But obviously the vast majority that you find will be German, and millions of these were imported. You find them all over the country. Every National Trust property has a couple, apart from John Lennon's house in Liverpool. There are also other creatures around the neck. That's not a face mask, but it's the face of a satyr, a mythological creature, just half one there. These were, you can see where it's been applied to the pot. These were produced using moulds, and the mould was carved out and a plaster mould and then pressed onto the neck to produce the face. We call these Bartman jugs. Often they have been known as Bellarmine, after Cardinal Bellarmine. The only problem with that attribution is that Cardinal Bellarmine was only 8 years old when these face masks started being produced on jugs. So I guess maybe he was just a very hairy child. So that's just an English name that had been applied to them, but archaeologists now call them Bartman, which is just German for bearded man jugs, which sounds fine to me. The great distinguishing feature of the Freken pottery is this wonderful tiger glaze, a salt glaze. So at one point during the firing they would throw handfuls of salt into the kiln and it would fuse on the surface to produce that speckled glaze, and that was actually highly prized at the time. The Tudors loved it, and they would mount these jugs with silver mounts and keep them as special things. So you do get some lovely examples of that speckled glaze, which is very different from the earlier glazes, which were much more uniformly brown, and again with the later ones as well. The base is quite distinctive. It's got that narrow base, and very soon the pot or jug curves up and around. Here's some photographs of some complete ones so you can see the shape more clearly. The base is also very distinctive because it has those wire marks, cheese wire marks. When they were made on the wheel, the potter would cut them off the base with a wire and then produce those concentric rings there, which is like a little fingerprint of Roarin, the Roarin industry. On the side of the pots they often had medallions. Sometimes one, sometimes three around the pot, and you get different designs. You get just sort of geometric ones like flowers, but more often than not you get medallions, heraldic medallions of shields. Sometimes these would be real devices made for a city or a merchant. The one of Amsterdam is very common. It's a crowned design with 3 crosses, 3 X's in a row underneath. You get various different ones of royal families. Ones are known with the English royal arms as well. But you do also get ones which are not produced for a specific individual. Actually, I'm sure it's probably that way up, maybe. But they would just use different masks. So you might get on a pot the Mask of Amsterdam on one side and the Mask of England on the other side, the Medallion of England on the other side. So they weren't for a specific customer, they were just decorative. And that goes with some of the German royal families as well, but always nice to find those. And occasionally also they would have medallions on them of people there. You can see the speckled brown glaze and a fine 16th century gentleman there. So very common, and pretty much anywhere you go on the foreshore you will find bits of that speckled salt glaze industry there. The last German stoneware industry that I'm going to look at today is out of Vesta Belt. This started in the 1590s and went right through to the end of the 18th century, exporting a lot to England and to the colonies in America. And that's very recognisable by the blue glaze on a light buff stoneware background there. We have documentary evidence that in 1667 they started using purple coloured glaze as well. So if you have purple and blue, you know you found a bit of stoneware which is after 1667, and I wish that all ceramic history could be that certain. Forms of Vesta Belt stoneware. In the 17th century, in the early 18th century, sorry, you get a lot of straight-sided drinking jugs, and quite often these would have a medallion with GR on it for Georgius Rex or King George. So those would be early Georgian pieces, 1700 to 1750. And these were imported to London in large numbers and to America. And here's a picture of one of those. The glaze is very uniform, and you normally find bands of blue, but also quite highly decorated in some of the earlier pots that they produced. The early pieces, the early 17th century ones, do have a sort of speckling to the glaze there, and the later ones just have a plain glaze there. That's the rim of a large tankard, and they're just plain glaze, not speckled, with blue decoration. With a squared off rim like that, these are normally from chamber pots, and there was a large industry at Vesta Belt making chamber pots, and they made them for about 100 years, from sort of 1700 to 1800. And they had a very uniform design of a blue medallion supported by two lions around the outside. So either they can be recognised by the rim, which is quite distinctive, or if you find a part of a lion or a part of a blue medallion, there's just a tail and the back of a lion, then you know it's coming from a Vesta Belt chamber pot. And I think they're quite pretty actually. There's lots of moulded decoration used to them, little stamps, different designs there, and the blue and white is always a popular one, so nice to find those. The blue glaze in the Vesta Belt comes from cobalt. Obviously there are lots of stoneware industries of which you find pieces in the Thames. As I mentioned briefly, huge quantities were made in London, the Dalton factories at Lambeth, and also in Staffordshire. So how would you tell German stoneware apart from English stoneware? Well, here are a couple of pointers that you can use. As I said, the most common German stonewares have that salt glaze speckled effect, whereas if you look at later Victorian stonewares, they're very sort of uniformly brown glazed there. So you can see the difference between the two, the early German stoneware and the Victorian stonewares. Most of the Victorian stoneware bottles have this sort of shape. Here's one I found on a dog walk once, which was quite nice. They're very straight-sided, and then they curve in towards a neck like that, or maybe like that. So that is the classic Victorian shape. There's no string marks on the bottom where it was cut off the wheel, because they're obviously made, I think, by machine. And different from the German stoneware necks there, and you can see the difference in the glazing there and there, and obviously difference in production. You know, the early German stoneware is very handmade, hand formed on a wheel, and the later Victorian stonewares very uniform, factory made, industrial revolution. And of course often the Victorian ones will have letters and maker's marks and the marks of what was in them, or the contents, where they were used, pub marks and merchandise marks there on them as well. Staffordshire stonewares, the earliest ones are a sort of grey coloured there. They're salt glazed, but they don't have that speckling like the German ones do. They do have moulded features there. There's a couple of hunting dogs from a Staffordshire. These are 18th century. It's very thin, pale blue marks on them sometimes. And you also get scratch blue, which looks a lot like Vesta Belt. It's not quite as blue as the Vesta Belt pieces. If I compare, the Vesta Belt is very deep blue there, and the scratch blue, the sort of Staffordshire ones, as well as being scratched, obviously, that's why they get their name, not quite as blue, I don't think. And yeah, so Staffordshire salt glaze pieces there in a sort of buff coloured one, and then later on you get brown glazed. Normally brown glazed in bands, like that's the top of a tankard, and they would dip it into the glaze, and you get that sort of brown uniform glaze, which is very much production of Staffordshire or Lambeth factories. These now going into the late 18th, early 19th centuries. There's a fine man sitting on his harvest there, and a man on a horse underneath him there. These are large round-bodied jugs there. So I hope that sort of gives a few pointers really as to how to tell the difference between the earlier stonewares and the Victorian stonewares, of which there are huge quantities in the Thames, as you would imagine. Thanks.